behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Costantino Moretti, who is an associate professor in Chinese, medieval Buddhism, and Dunhuang studies at the FAO, and he's currently the head of their office in Tokyo, in a talk entitled Mix-Ups and Touch-Ups in Medieval Chinese Buddhist Manuscripts. Please join me in welcoming this
Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much for these kind words, and I would like to first of all I would like to thank John, Professor Kishnik, who kindly invited me to give this talk. It's not only a pleasure, but I would say a privilege to be here today and in this prestigious university to give this talk. And of course, I would like also to thank Irene and Leah and all the other people involved in the organization of this lecture for their kind help and attention to all the details. And of course, many thanks to the University of Stanford and in particular to the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies who sponsored this and other very interesting events. And I should say that I'm particularly grateful to the Robert H. and O. Family Foundation also for other reasons. As you may know, the institute where I work, the FAO, or École Française d'Extrême-Orient, had the chance to be granted one of these professorships sponsored by the O Foundation, and I had the chance to be selected to hold this position, and 4 years later I was lucky enough to get tenured. And so, of course, I am extremely grateful, and I do not forget the important role of the foundation in this process. So today I will be talking about mix-ups and touch-ups in medieval Chinese Buddhist manuscripts, and I will focus, as mentioned by John, on this famous corpus, which is referred to as the Dunhuang manuscripts. Corpus which I believe doesn't need any specific introduction here. So I will present a few general observations regarding various types of textual alterations, what I call mix-ups, and corrections, what I call touch-ups. That is to say, elements which help us to get a better understanding of some aspects of scriptural transmission in medieval China. So I will offer a few points concerning the mechanisms linked to the production of specific textual and formal alterations in medieval manuscripts, elements which also provide information of codicological interest, in particular on the characteristics of a manuscript archetype, on its production techniques and its, let's say, formal evolution. So to begin with, we should note that the question of scribal errors in medieval manuscripts from a codicological point of view has mainly been studied to explore the scribal practices employed to rectify or to highlight mistakes made during the copying or during the assembling of a manuscript. And quite surprisingly, there are just a few Western scholars who have treated this topic for medieval China. In particular, my professor, Jean-Pierre Drège, and Olivier Venture in Paris, and of course, Imre Golambusch. But apart from the techniques for correcting scribal mistakes, what is also interesting are the mechanisms related to the production of mistakes in Buddhist scriptures. Mechanisms that also provide us with information about the characteristics of the source text, of the source manuscript, and of course about the copying process, and more in general, I would say, about the scriptural transmission process. So I will start with a few general observations, and I will try to provide a number of specific examples of codicological or textual elements which contribute to the spread of mistakes in the transmission of a text in manuscript form. And when talking about textual alterations, scholars or even students generally make reference to what we may call intentional or accidental errors. That is to say, elements that modify a, let's say, normalized version of a given text. And there is sometimes a general tendency to confuse what is a scribal error and a textual variant, and what is a textual variant. This is evident, for example, in modern editions of the Buddhist canon, and I believe that you are all very familiar with these sources that contain extremely useful footnotes indicating variants, and it is quite clear, I think, that a number of presumed variants in these editions are in fact simple copying mistakes that we may call unintentional mistakes. And I will come back to this point. So here in this slide you have a very simple example. You can take a look at this footnote number 8, making reference to a section of the Chang Ahan Jing. And here the footnote says that the character shi, which means different things, but sometimes translates the word loka, for example, corresponds to sang shi. But if you are familiar with the handwritten form of the character sang shi, which is sa, you will definitely you will easily figure out that it's highly reminiscent of the character shi. So we are probably dealing with a simple scribal error and not with a consistent variant. But this is a very simple example. On the other hand, some alterations in many cases correspond to what we may call intentional, or better yet, reductional corrections, which at times involve substantial deviation from the original meaning of a sentence. So if we wanted to give a general definition of this type of variants, we could define this phenomenon as, let's say, an excess of enthusiasm on the part of a scribe who, failing to understand a passage, somehow oversteps his role to erroneously correct a sentence on the basis of his knowledge. That is to say that a scribe in these circumstances acts as an exegete, for example, replacing unusual words with more familiar ones, or maybe makes a sentence less controversial by replacing a complex reading with a simpler one. And this is true, of course, for any manuscript culture and not specifically for medieval China. But in the case of Buddhist scriptures, we should also keep in mind that they were, as we all know, translated from Indic languages into Chinese. And so, needless to say, the translation process was quite complex. It was the result of a collaborative work carried out by a team including scribes, individuals in charge of verifying the translation, proofreaders, and professionals who assembled the manuscript, etc. And here you can see in the colophon of this relatively famous manuscript from the Pelliu collection a list of all the participants to one of these translation sessions. So, of course, many alterations and mistakes could arise in this context, and for example, the translation process could also give rise to textual elements such as short commentaries or glosses, which at a certain point became part of the text itself because they were accidentally integrated into the text, also due to the specific layout of Chinese exegetical literature. And similarly, technical instructions linked to a subsequent transmission phase or collation work left on the page by accident were sometimes accidentally integrated into the text. And an interesting example is provided by this copy of the Diamond Sutra on your left, which is included in the corpus of medieval manuscripts found inside the pagoda of the Shengde Temple in Shanxi. So at the end of one paragraph, we can read in smaller script, 加60字, that is to say, add 60 characters. And the paragraph that follows contains precisely 60 characters. And there are no signs of restoration, which indicates that the omission had already been rectified in a previous copy. So this technical instruction, most likely found in the source manuscript, was copied by inadvertence. And moreover, the scribe sometimes becomes a translator, so to speak. I remember having a conversation years ago with the late Professor Stefano Zacchetti concerning the transcription of a text of a manuscript I was working on, and Stefano told me, be very careful because punctuating is translating. And this is evident, but this is true, and this is true for us. It was also true in medieval China. Of course, the act of punctuating a text corresponds at least to a certain extent to translating. So a scribe, or more likely a reader, may add the punctuation to a scripture, and the act of punctuating a text which was translated from Indic languages by teams of translators also corresponded, at least to a certain extent, to a philological reconstruction. And by the way, this is evident, for example, from modern Chinese philological works, which essentially consist in separating the sentences of ancient scriptures by providing punctuation. And also, it is likely that if a text was punctuated, this was probably linked to practical uses of a manuscript for reading, for religious practices, and studying. And for example, in this copy of the Lotus Sutra in the British collection, which possibly dates back to the 7th century, the text was punctuated according to its colophon for helping neophytes unable to separate correctly the words and sentences, or more precisely, the passages where the 4-character separation rule was not applicable. That is to say, sentences considered to be problematic. And by the way, incidentally, this colophon, which consists of 5 columns, as you can see, contains no less than 3 errors, indicating that even readers wishing to help other readers were sometimes prone to making mistakes. So we have 2 flipped characters and 1 omission. So I don't know if we can really trust the punctuation provided by this person. So let's go back to unintentional errors, and to begin with a simple point, what types of mistakes can be regarded as unintentional? Well, generally speaking, these mistakes can arise in any of the various phases of textual transmission. And this process is described by Alphonse Dain, who was a professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, where I also teach in the 40s, and was a specialist in Greek paleography. And so this process involves at least 4 phases, that is to say, a scribe reading or hearing a passage, memorizing it, and repeating it to himself long enough to write it down. So at any point in this process, unintentional errors could arise due to various factors. For example, the source manuscript contains complex script, the scribe finds it difficult to decipher, or for example, during the phase of memorizing a sentence, one can forget parts of the text, or during the phase of mental dictation and writing, one can accidentally omit 1 or more characters. And so what about the mechanisms linked to the production of these specific mistakes, these specific types of mistakes? So in this case, the first question we might ask ourselves when we examine a manuscript is if that manuscript was copied via dictation or from a source manuscript that the scribe had right in front of him. So we can come across mistakes linked to hearing, which can help us to make hypotheses about an oral transmission of a text via dictation, for example. They are particularly significant in Chinese due to the great number of homophones, as you know, but we should be also very careful. We can cite as an example this manuscript containing a copy of the Tafang Deng Toloni Jin, undated, but possibly produced before 500 and written by a monk named Seng Ai. And in one sentence here, as you can see, the character shou, which means to receive, for example, has been expunged by means of 3 dots on the right side of the column. That is to say, one of the most typical correction marks in medieval China. And it was immediately made followed by the correct character shou, which means long life. So based on this simple correction, it is difficult to determine if this manuscript was copied via oral transmission or not. But the absence of other mistakes of the same kind invokes caution in formulating hypotheses and would seem to suggest a transposition linked to memory. With respect to the Dunhuang manuscripts, various what we call pièges à copistes in French, something like scribe traps, in English, linked to sites, would seem to provide more reliable evidence of written transmission. For example, mistakes common to all types of manuscripts are associated with a particularly sensitive phase in the copying process when the scribe looks away from the source manuscript while writing a section of the text, and due to resuming reading from another point, either anticipates parts of the text that follow or repeats sentences that had already been copied, so resulting in either omissions or additions. And these kinds of mistakes are quite frequent, of course, in Buddhist scriptures due to their textual structure, which often contains similar or identical text blocks and technical terms repeated over and over in making an argument. I think you're all familiar with this. So all these elements may cause a certain confusion for the scribe. Here you have an example of anticipation. So in this manuscript, the scribe has mistakenly copied a portion of the second column of a section of the Faju Jing, or the Chinese translation of the Dharmapada, before copying the first column. So 4 characters were scratched out and rewritten, revealing to us the mechanism leading to scribal error. That is to say that the scribe had copied the first half of the first column, these 8 characters ending with the character Tian. But as in the second sentence, as you can see from this slide, 6 characters are identical to those on the first column and immediately next to each other in terms of layout. So when repositioning his gaze on the source manuscript, the scribe has mistakenly followed the text in the second column in the source manuscript, writing this passage in the wrong position. However, when the scribe came to copying the second column, the mistake came to light, and 4 characters had to be erased and rectified. Here you have another example of the same kind. On your right, you can see that there are 2 sentences ending with the same characters, Wei None, and so one of them was skipped due to an I skipped. And on your left, a skip of paper was used to correct a problem involving 8 characters anticipated by accident. So alterations can also be linked to the text layout or to the manuscript architecture, and errors and misinterpretations of various kinds could also arise during any of the production phase, for example, when structuring the text, while proofreading the text, or assembling the material support, and of course during a subsequent transmission. That is to say, different alterations that can be defined as codicological accidents, and here I am quoting Jean Irigoyen. The layout of the source manuscript may contribute to this process, in particular when phenomena similar to homeoarchy or homeoteluton occur at the beginning or end of a column, and the corrections found in different manuscripts show how a number of textual variants may have been produced. So these 2 types of mistakes occur in this fragment of the Lotus Sutra, where the scribe has skipped one 17-character column due to identical ending characters in the previous column on your right, and a second time due to the fact that 2 columns started with the same characters as the skipped one, similar to what happens in cases of homeoarchy on your left. In these 2 examples, in this example, you can see that two lines of a sentence which end with the same characters are accidentally repeated. So it is the opposite type of example. In this manuscript of the 9th century, the mistake has been highlighted in the top page margin, where we read two columns repeated. 中书而横. And here you have another relatively famous example provided by this copy of the Shi Di Jing Lun, dated to 594. Here the scribe has skipped one column because the preceding column ended with the same three characters. So a strip of paper was added in the intercolumn to rectify the omission, revealing that the source manuscript had the same format and layout as the copy. That is to say, it was most likely a scroll and with 17 characters column. So we can also gain some information on the hypothetical source text layout, considering these types of mistakes. And here you have another example of exactly the same type. The difference is that here we are dealing with a concertina and not with a scroll. And here the scribe has skipped not one but two columns. And so what can we learn from this? We can learn that the source manuscript most likely had the same layout. That is to say, probably was a concertina, but maybe also a codex, because sometimes the layout is quite similar. And that the scribe has skipped two columns instead of one, as was more typical in the other examples. So this is relatively interesting. I believe it's particularly interesting because similar phenomena can be attested in the printed editions of the Buddhist canon. However, the reasons for these different readings are less evident in printed editions, which include punctuation, modified layout, and other modern paratextual elements. So in this case, for example, the 17-character standard format, which was adopted for official copies as early as the Tang, is quite useful in such considerations. So as you know, most of the scriptures intended for an official library were written in standard format with 17 characters per column. And so by way of example, I will make reference to a footnote indicating a variant in this text, the Forger Shengjing. And here you have this footnote number 2, where we read that 17 characters are missing in the so-called 3 editions of the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. So a possible textual variant, both combination with or without this sentence would seem to work. However, if we imagine the text in manuscript form, we may figure out that the character preceding this string of text was identical to the last of these 17 characters, so indicating that this variant was most likely caused by the accidental skipping of a 17 characters column in the transmission process. So we're dealing again with a typical scribal error and not with a consistent textual variant. And moreover, from a codicological standpoint, a variant or a mistake or an alteration might be more broadly defined as an element that deforms the manuscript, which served as a model by altering its layout and formal characteristics in such a way as to affect the transmission of the original text. So we can include in this type of alterations intentional, let's say, modification of the layout, in some cases due to the evolution of manuscript standard formats. So another level of misunderstanding involving the layout of the text or the codicological unit happens, for example, when a scribe either introduces formal or functional elements which modify, maybe incorrectly, the source text, or when the scribe omits formal or functional elements which are fundamental to the understanding of a text. And now I will go into more details, providing one example involving what I think is a misunderstanding or alteration of the layout of the source manuscript. and I studied this specific example in one of my papers entitled Scribal Errors in Medieval Chinese Manuscripts, published in the Tunpao if you're interested. And in this example found in this manuscript Pelliot 2824, which contains a beautiful and complex cosmological chart. As you can see, there is a combination of iconography and text in this vertical scroll, which is entitled Chart of the Three Realms and the Nine Lands, and which displays a schematic representation of Buddhist cosmology, a representation which is linked to specific scriptural sources, in particular the Chinese translation of the Abhidharma Kosha by Xuanzang. And in this paper, which is published in the book mentioned by Professor Kishnik during the introduction, La Fabrique du Lisible. So in this paper, my colleague Françoise Van Toutain has analyzed each component of this chart, providing a detailed analysis of the cosmological aspects of this scroll. So I will not go into further detail concerning these aspects. So in this chart, we have three types of inscriptions. So the first type is, let's say, descriptive type inscriptions or title-like inscriptions, given the general name of the cosmological element they are linked to. For example, here you have Zhigong, Yuegong, Dishigong, etc. And then you have a second type, which are explanatory type, let's say, or more extensive inscriptions, giving a few details on the elements they explain. And then we have a third type, that is to say, inscriptions relating to religious practice, which focus more specifically on meditation practices. But the short text I want to show you is in the lower part of the scroll, where the three bad destinies of animals, the hungry ghosts, and the hells are depicted. So even at first glance, the interpretation of this text is problematic. I display here the text in English translation to give you a better idea. For example, the text starts with a sentence concerning hell number 8, which is typically the Avicii hell in the standard system. And then it continues with the 7th, and then the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and then the 1st. So it doesn't really make sense, right? And Professor Hu Tongqing, a Chinese scholar, in a paper published in 1996, has highlighted that certain sentences, as you can see from this slide, would seem to follow naturally from the preceding ones, while others were most likely written in the wrong direction. However, it was not able to explain, it was unable to explain how the sentences were mixed up, and Françoise Van Toutain has not addressed this point because it was not really the goal of her paper. So before going any further, so I should highlight that the scroll's general layout is quite particular, as a part of the texts are arranged in a sort of mirror image. That is to say that the texts directly to the left of the pagoda are written from right to left in the, let's say, usual direction, and those on the right side from left to right. So in this example, we have left to right writing only on the right side of the manuscript, and with the main goal of giving the impression of a symmetrical structure. So one would first assume that this text concerning the hills should be read in one direction or in the other to be understood. However, if you try to do that, you will just see that it doesn't work. And but the general appearance of its layout, as you can see from this picture, with the last column terminating before the end of the available space, would seem to suggest that the text was written from right to left. And a closer look to this text shows that, in fact, it is made of coherent sentences which would seem to be arranged in a sort of confusing manner. And Professor Hutung Ching has highlighted that by arranging them in a different way, it is possible to obtain 3 text blocks. So the first one is this one, which makes reference to the so-called 16 secondary hills. And then the second one makes reference to 8 hills, which are referred to as cold hills in various sources. And this is the last one, which makes reference to the 8 major haut hills. So the crucial point is how were the sentences mixed up like this. For example, you can see here A is the first coherent sentence, but then it continues there, where you see B, and then the third one is C, and it's all like this until the end of the inscription. So what I did in order to try to answer this question is relatively simple. So I tried to imagine how the text layout of the source manuscript may have been, and how the scribe could have deviated so far from it as to produce this incomprehensible inscription. And the answer is that most likely the scribe has mistakenly copied from right to left a text which was originally written from left to right. And moreover, the most important point is that we can imagine that the scribe did not reproduce the same layout and column breaks as the source manuscript he had in front of him, because he had a different material support and had to arrange this text in a different page layout. So to reconstruct the hypothetical source text layout, I carried out various philological experiments, let's say, and at a certain point I worked from right to left and tried to make column breaks each time a sentence did not follow on to the next in terms of coherence. And this way I obtained what I believe is the hypothetical layout of the source text the hypothetical layout of the text in the source manuscript. So I imagined the scribe copied this text in a continuous flow from right to left, and then he created new column breaks where necessary to adapt the text of the source manuscript in the space available to him in the Paleo manuscript. And if we copy the source text from right to left and try to make it fit, let's say, into the space available in the Paleo manuscript, we obtain precisely the same confusing sentence order. Okay, to make it simpler, imagine that this is your source text, but you start to copy this text from the other directions, from right to left, like this. But then, why to waste paper, which is very expensive, and we still have room for writing here. And so I continue writing this way. And then I have a column which is almost blank. So again, why to waste more paper? And so I continue copying this way until the end of my inscription. The result is that most likely I did a very good thing for the planet, but maybe not for the history of the transmission of this short inscription. So when I first read this text, my first hypothesis was that this reverse copying was maybe a consequence of the heterogeneous nature of book production in the 9th or 10th century, which witnessed the coexistence of various material supports, languages, manuscript cultures, and practices, scribal practices in the region of Dunhuang. However, after this trial, I am more inclined to believe that the mistake was produced more simply by a misunderstanding of the general layout of the source manuscript. So, apart from the important role of entertaining people like us with this sort of cryptographic puzzle. What can we learn from these types of mistakes? So at least two things. The first one is that this phenomenon shows that, at least in certain cases, the scribes involved in the production of Buddhist documents were most likely not very familiar with the material they were copying. And the second one, more important and more general conclusion, is that the analysis of the formal characteristics of a manuscript is an important tool to gain a better understanding of a given textual manuscript tradition. And we have seen how important are column breaks. So corrections linked to the imperfect rendering of the layout are also important elements to define filiation between witnesses and to establish the genealogy of a manuscript. For example, modern scholars tend to overlook or underestimate paragraph divisions made by line breaks, as these elements are not considered being part of the text proper, but I am more and more convinced that line breaks were less randomly defined than expected. At least this is the impression we may get when analyzing corrections linked to these elements. In this copy of the Parinirvana Sutra, possibly dating to the 6th century, so a proofreader has written a red dot, as you can see, in the middle of the column, and this element has been highlighted by a second red dot on top of the page. So while there would not seem to be any mistake in this sentence, if we check other copies of this text containing the same section, we realize that the text block that follows is often preceded by a line break, indicating that most likely this red dot highlights a layout rendering mistake. So the layout with no line break in this portion of the text would seem to characterize the oldest copies of this scripture, including two manuscripts tentatively dated to the 5th or to the 6th century, as is the case for the above manuscript in the French collection. And similarly, in two manuscripts on your left, containing a copy of the Yingguo Jing, a column break missing in both manuscripts would seem to indicate possible filiation based on formal characteristics. So, in short, I think that the analysis of formal characteristics is also very useful to try to define the genealogy of two or more manuscripts, which may be linked not only by some, let's say, philological characteristics or some specific textual variants, but also by these types of formal elements. In the last part of my talk, I will say a few words concerning manuscripts which include specific types of corrections that would seem to involve revision work carried out to establish or to restore a scriptural tradition, for example, by comparing different versions of a text and by integrating textual elements into the target manuscript. So, as we all know, one of the earliest large-scale collation projects in East Asian Buddhism is represented by the work carried out by this famous Korean monk named Sugi, who supervised the publication of the second Korean edition of the Buddhist canon during the 13th century, and the wood blocks of the first Korean edition were destroyed during the Mongol invasion of 1234, and a few years later a second edition was prepared. So the second edition was the result of a collation work, involving three available sources: the famous Kaibao canon, published in China around 983, the first Korean edition. The wood blocks were lost, as I said, during the invasion, but printed copies were still available, and the Khitan canon, published in 1068. So there was a complex collation work carried out, a work that this Korean monk also documented in a text entitled Collation Notes to the Koryo Buddhist Canon, in which he explains the editorial choices, for example, in selecting specific readings, and also clarifies how he rectified some mistakes found in previous editions of the canon. So it's an extremely interesting work, a work that Professor Baswell has studied in detail. For example, here is one entry concerning the Mahavibhasha, and the Sugi has highlighted a dithography in 2 editions, an element which was rectified. And moreover, one point that I am particularly interested in this collation work also takes into account differences in scroll division of scriptures included in the new edition of the Buddhist canon. So these issues, again, are often overlooked by modern scholars, but most likely they were considered important points by our predecessors. For example, in this entry, Sugi has highlighted a problem of scroll and chapter division in the Tajiji. So this is one of the earliest examples that we have, but it's still relatively late and concerns a large-scale project. So what about earlier examples of phenomena which are similar to or can be related to forms of collation work, or at least revision work in Chinese medieval manuscripts, and carried out on a smaller scale? So this is one of the major topics I am interested in this period, and today I would just set forth some marginal aspects of this topic and some research issues that I came across by analyzing corrections found in Dunhuang manuscripts. So as we all know, a significant number of Dunhuang manuscripts or Buddhist scriptures in manuscript form contain various correction layers, at times involving black and red ink at the same time, or different handwriting styles, and showing revision marks which would seem to be made by different individuals. As we have seen, some of these corrections are very simple and easy to explain, as they concern unintentional errors. But in other cases, the interpretation of the mechanisms linked to the production and to the corrections of specific mistakes is more difficult to explain. In particular, if we consider the macroscopic alteration of the original text layout produced by some errors. In this case, the idea that the scribe may have deviated so far from the source manuscript would seem to be more unlikely, and so these types of errors may have been produced by accident, but in an earlier phase of the transmission process. So to speak, they can be considered sort of old wounds, old injuries in the body of the text. So how can we identify corrections which were not made simply by comparing, let's say, manuscript 1 with manuscript 2, but possibly involved at least another witness in this process? So I will take as an example this manuscript containing a copy of a scripture entitled Tasheng Mianjin, and here we can distinguish 2 correction layers. In black are corrections probably made by the scribe himself and involving omitted or flipped characters, as well as wrong characters scratched out and rewritten. And in red are corrections that were probably made by another individual, let's say a proofreader. So these corrections concern character variants or mistakes, as well as characters or sentences omitted due to the phenomenon referred as eye skip. So at first glance, we could conclude that these are unintentional errors that the scribe has made while copying the source manuscripts. However, there are a few points that should be considered before jumping to such a conclusion. The first one, a number of characters that the proofreader has corrected in red are indeed attested variants found in other editions of this scripture. So we cannot call them unintentional mistakes. Second, the regular use of column breaks to distinguish the different parts of the text, and the characters expanded toward the bottom of the column so as to try to fill them, would seem to indicate that the scribe was trying to make a facsimile of the source manuscript. That is to say that he was trying to copy in each column the same characters found in the source manuscript. As you can see, he left a lot of space between the characters at the end of some columns. And moreover, two omissions in the versified section involving one column skipped due to omioteluton and one strophe missing due to an eye skip were not noticed by the scribe despite their significant incidence on the text layout. So it is quite surprising that the scribe, who most likely was trying to make an exact copy of a text, did not notice that well-ordered verses in the source manuscript were mixed up together in the copy he was producing. So you can imagine that the scribe was looking at this and then he produced this. It is quite strange. So all these elements would seem to suggest that these specific errors were already found in the source manuscript that the scribe had in front of him. So if this is the case, then the corrections in red that we have seen would be based on another copy of this text, maybe a more comprehensive tradition, and the production chain of the above mistakes would be more complex. That is to say that the proofreader has rectified errors found in a secondary witness circulating at the same time as the primary witness, errors that were produced by accident in another branch of this textual tradition and were disseminated in later copies. So what we may call like old injuries. So in this case, the corrections in red that we have seen are highly reminiscent of collation work rather than corrections. And examples of this kind are less unusual than expected in Dunhuang, and at times also highlight problems concerning not the text itself, but its structure or its distribution in various scrolls or in separate codicological units, as is the case with the collation work carried out by Sugi during the compilation of the second edition of the Korean canon. So here you have an interesting example of this kind in this long fragment of the Chinese translation of the Prajna Paramita. So this manuscript is made of two distinct units, one manuscript possibly dating back to the 6th century, according to Fan Guangchang on your left, and the one later manuscript possibly dating back to the 7th or to the 8th century, which was glued to this one before the first sheet. So still, they have something in common, that is to say that both of them include corrections and additions made with red ink, or more precisely, two correction layers. Here, some redundant characters were scratched out. Most likely, the scribe copied 2 times these 4 characters by accident, and then we have more consistent corrections in red, which mainly concern minor textual variants and missing sentences. And at the end of the manuscript, there are 2 interesting things. The end title was modified. Scroll number 8 became scroll number 7. And even more interesting, there is a short note also in red ink stating that a section of this text should get into the 8th scroll. That is to say, indicating a mistake in the major division of this text. And the scroll division highlighted by this note should be placed here. And well, as you know, there are hundreds of copies of this scripture in the in the Dunhuang manuscripts. But I was lucky enough to find at least one which corresponds precisely to this scroll division, a manuscript kept in the Beijing collection and possibly dating to the 7th century. So the interesting thing is that the additions and corrections produced with red ink correspond precisely to the text contained in this version involving the specific scroll division indicated in the note. And we should also say that the text as it is, without the elements in red, is correct and corresponds to specific recensions of this sutra attested in Dunhuang and also in printed editions of the Buddhist canon. So this means that these corrections in red were made by comparing a recension of this scripture that the proofreader considered more up-to-date or more standardized. And by the way, I also asked myself if the proofreader based his correction precisely on this manuscript that I identified, or if this manuscript is the result of this sort of collation work. So after finding various examples of this kind, I now ask myself how many manuscripts involving elements which at first glance look like simple corrections and are indicated in catalogs of Dunhuang manuscripts as, so to speak, regular corrections, how many of them are indeed the result of a more complex process of textual analysis. Textual analysis made by comparing different editions, different versions, or different recension of a given text. And in these cases, what type of editing process are we dealing with? Maybe collation work, or maybe revision work, or just the process of updating obsolete texts. But then, in which context these procedures were carried out? So these are just a few marginal aspects of this important topic, that is to say, understanding how was carried out revision, collation, correction work involving copies of long-established translation of Buddhist scriptures in medieval China. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for your attention.